Good morning, and thank you for another opportunity of talking about the flood. And last week, what we talked about was arguments that a global flood actually happened compared to a local flood. So we argued that a natural reading of both the Old Testament and the New Testament points to a global flood. A global flood was the dominant position prior to the Enlightenment and the rise of naturalistic philosophy. A global flood is attested to by many cultures around the world, and I also point to a lot of evidence for a young Earth. We looked at the sedimentary layers span a very large region, pretty much covers continent-wide. There's marine fossils in all the sedimentary layers, even on top of all the mountain ranges in the world. Fossils point to a rapid burial. In order to have a fossil, it needs to be rapidly buried, and I gave some extreme examples of that last week. We have documented cases of rapid strata deposition and erosion, in particular at Mount St. Helens. And then we did a thought experiment about what should the sedimentary strata pattern look like if each layer represented millions of years. And I argue that it doesn't align with that, but it aligns more with a global flood. And all of that is, I believe it's on Perimeter's site already, but I also have the notes on the Facebook group if you want to take a look at that. So today, given that a global flood occurred, given my arguments previously, what we're going to talk about today is what happened during the flood. And we'll look at it from a scriptural point of view, and then we'll also look at it from a global flood models that creation scientists have proposed. So we'll look at the conditions before the flood, and then we'll look at the flood event, and then we'll look at conditions after the flood, according to the Bible. And then there's 4 models that we'll be talking about today. So conditions before the flood. In Genesis 1:6, it says that there was an expanse in the midst of the waters. Now, we don't really know exactly what that means. There's several interpretations of this. One interpretation is there's water on the earth, and then there's expanse of the sky, and then there's maybe some water in the upper atmosphere. Or you can interpret as there's water on the earth, and maybe there's water in outer space, so that the expanse is like the heavens. Or it could be there's water on the surface of the earth, and then there's maybe water under the earth. So there's different views on what exactly this could be. Obviously, there were seas, so in Genesis 1:10, it mentions there were seas. And in Genesis 2:5 and 6, it mentions that God had not caused it to rain on the land, and a mist was coming up from the land. So it seems as if it didn't rain originally, and the way that the vegetation got their water was from mist from the land. In Genesis 7:11 and 12, it talks about all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heavens were opened, and rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. Genesis 7:17, it says the water increased, bore up the ark, and the waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth. And Genesis 7:19, all the mountains under the whole heaven were covered. And the waters prevailed on the earth for 150 days. So we have 2 dates here. We have this 40 days, and then we have this 150 days. In Genesis 9:13, after the flood, God set a bow in the cloud, a rainbow in the cloud, and it will be a sign of the covenant between God and the earth. Now, by implication, it seems to imply that that's when it started to rain, because you need rain for rainbows. In Genesis 8:22, it's the first mention of seasons, cold and heat, summer and winter. So some propose that there probably wasn't that cold and heat, summer and winter prior to the flood. The length of the flood was 375 days. So we can calculate that from Genesis 7:11. It mentions the start. And then in Genesis 8:14, it mentions the end. And we'll take a look at that in the next chart here. So the stages of the flood. So we have Noah's age. So he was 600 years old. And the second month, in the 17th day, was the beginning of the flood. So the rain began, the fountains of the deep broke open, and then on day 40, the rain stops, and the ark starts to rise then. On day 150, the water stops rising and begins receding, and then the ark hits the ground. On day 224, the mountains were visible. On day 314, the ground was dry. And then day 375, the earth was dry, and then they departed from the ark. And so on day 314, the way I interpret ground dry is the ground locally around that area was dry. And then on day 375, the ground on the entire earth was dry. So here's a little graph of what happened. So it started raining for 140 days. So the sea level started rising up to that point. And then the rain stopped. But the seas continued to rise up until day 150. And then it started to decline after that point until day 375. And we don't know exactly where the sea level was before and after, but I just placed it here. Probably the sea level was above what it was prior. So a lot of questions come up. So we look at the fossil record, and we see these huge animals. We see these dinosaurs, see these huge plants. So how did the animals and plants get so large in the past? We read in the Bible that people lived in a very long age. How did people live so long? And there was a dramatic shift prior to the flood and after the flood. So what affected the environment or whatever to cause a drastic change between the size of the animals, size of the plants, and the longevity of humans? Another obvious question is, how can all the mountains be covered by water? The Bible is pretty explicit about that. And where did all the water come from to cover all the mountains? Where did all the water go? Where did all the sediments come from to bury everything? And we talked about the pattern last week. How do you explain that sedimentary strata pattern of parallel layers being deposited quickly, and then after that was deposited, you see tectonic activity and then erosion? So hopefully we'll be able to answer many of these questions today. So we have 4 global flood views. There's others, but I'm picking the most popular ones. There's the simplistic view, the canopy theory, cataclysmic plate tectonics, and hydroplate theory. So just out of curiosity, how many here have heard of the cataclysmic plate tectonics? 2. Okay. How many people here heard of hydroplate theory? I see someone scratching their chin. I don't count that as raising their hand. Okay, 0. I'll say 0. Okay, so you'll learn some things today. So the simplistic view is just simply presented as raining for 40 days. There's no mention of any major geologic changes during the flood. There's the assumption that the mountains and the oceans were the same back then as now. This is the view that's commonly attacked by the skeptics, because they say, well, how in the world can all the mountains of the world be covered by water? And then where did all that water go? Now, this view is not accepted by any popular creation scientists. And so this is more of a distortion of what the Bible presents. Now, a very popular theory was the canopy theory, and I'm sure most of you have heard of this. The canopy theory proposes some sort of water, either in a liquid state, ice state, vapor state, in the upper atmosphere. And it was proposed because that provided the additional water for the flood. And it also had a few other things that it could explain. It protected the Earth from harmful radiation. It provided higher atmospheric pressure. It provided a more uniform temperature, and it was more tropical. And all of these things attempts to address the long ages prior to the flood for both the dinosaurs, plants, and humans. However, this was proposed by, the proponents were several people. Jerome was a very popular person that had believed in it. Immanuel Kant, interestingly. Isaac Newton Vail, different from Isaac Newton. But most people know about it through Henry Morris and John Wickham in The Genesis Flood when they published the book in 1961. And so that was what they proposed. Now, it was a very good first model to try to address all the questions that we had earlier, but currently it has largely been abandoned by all the major creation science organizations. The reason is because of these reasons. If there was that much water in the atmosphere, it would be impossible to see the stars because it would be like a permanent cloud cover. If it was water vapor and then it turned into liquid water, that would cause so much heat on the surface of the planet, it would cook the entire planet. It does not address where the water went. It does not address the sedimentary strata, and it does not address the fossils. So even though the canopy theory has largely been abandoned, I think there's still some aspects of it that still could be true, but by itself, it cannot answer all these questions, and it also had some problems. So because of that, today we have two major models by the creation organizations. There's the cataclysmic plate tectonics, so that is endorsed by Answers in Genesis, Institute for Creation Research, and Creation Ministries International. The hydroplate theory is proposed by the Center for Scientific Creation by Walt Brown, and we're going to look at these models for the rest of the time here. So, catastrophic plate tectonics. This was proposed by John Baumgartner in 1986. It is similar to standard plate tectonics. The only difference is that the plate movement is very rapid. And also another difference was it was initiated by runaway subduction. We'll talk about this. John Baumgartner has his master's in EE from Princeton. He has a PhD in geophysics from UCLA, and he has been in the military and the Air Force. Okay, so catastrophic plate tectonics is the same as plate tectonics. However, the plates moved around 1 billion times faster during the flood. So for those who believe in normal plate tectonics, the plates are moving about 0.5 inch to 6 inches per year. However, in catastrophic tectonics, it's moving at several feet per second during the flood. So it's much, much faster. So that's really the biggest difference. So I'm just going to quickly go over what is plate tectonics in order to explain catastrophic plate tectonics. So the crust is comprised of multiple plates, and plate tectonics is a relatively recent theory, and it started gaining wide acceptance in the mid-1960s. Plates were originally all together in Pangaea, and then since that time it got split up. The plates are slowly moving, and they're recycled back into the Earth. So the plates are on the surface of the Earth, and then it's being recycled into the mantle, and then it's coming back up again. So it's almost like a giant conveyor belt. Now, so you have different boundaries of the plate tectonics. You have divergent boundaries where the plates are moving away from each other, and that's where the crust is being formed. So that is where the lava and the magma from the mantle is coming up, and then it is pushing the plates away and forming new crust. You have the convergent boundaries where the boundaries are coming together, and where those are coming together, either one plate is going down into the mantle and being recycled, or the plate is forming the mountains. So I have a quick animation of this for normal. Okay. Let's see if it'll. Okay. So in standard plate tectonics, this happens over 200 million years. In the catastrophic plate tectonics, this happened during the flood. Do it again. It was so exciting. If I can. Okay, there we go. So that's really the biggest difference between normal plate tectonics and catastrophic plate tectonics is there was probably some slow movement prior to the flood, but a runaway subduction caused this rapid start of the plate movement, and then during the end of the flood, that rapid plate movement stopped, and then they go back to the slow movement. So the question is, what is this? Before we go that, here's another video, another animation. Let's see if I can get that going. There we go. Okay. So when in the divergent plates, as it was coming up so fast, it was causing the water at the oceans to rain. And here is a divergent boundary. And so you see the magma coming up, and it's moving the crust like a conveyor belt, and then it's going back into the mantle. Of course, in regular plate tectonics, this is happening very slowly, but in catastrophic plate tectonics, it's happening very quickly. And then at the convergent boundaries, we see this massive flooding the continents. So runaway subduction. So what is proposed is these plates that are on the surface are cold, dense plates, relatively speaking. And below in the mantle are hot, buoyant rock. And because you have this imbalance of the heavy on top and the light on the bottom, it's going to flip. And so the heavy plates on top is going to subduct very quickly into the mantle, and then that in turn is going to have that light material go back onto the surface. And because of that rapid motion, there was a lot of energy. Molten rock is created at the divergent boundaries, generating high temperature. At those points, the high temperature is rapidly boiling the water and then ejecting that into the atmosphere. And the ocean bottom sediments near that area is ejected into the air as a source of all the sediments that flooded the earth. So in a nutshell, that is catastrophic plate tectonics. It's the same as plate tectonics, except it was a billion times faster. So hydroplate theory is proposed by Walt Brown, and I'll cover more of these details later, but a high overview. What it proposes is that there was subterranean water beneath the crust prior to the flood. And I talked about earlier about that expanse covering between water and water. What Walt Brown is saying is that expanse is actually the crust. And there's water on the surface, and then there's water beneath the surface. The crust split at the mid-oceanic ridges, where we have the mid-oceanic ridges now. Prior to the flood, there was no mid-oceanic ridge. It was just one solid crust covering the entire Earth. When the flood started, the crack happened on the crust at the mid-oceanic ridges, and then the subterranean water underneath came out of that cracks, rained for 40 days. And the water continued to come out of that cracks and erode the crust for 150 days, and the water kept on rising. During that point, the crust hit the mantle below, buckled, and then it formed the mountains at the end of that stage, and then the waters receded into the oceans. So I'm going to go more details about that. Walt Brown has a PhD in mechanical engineering. He was also as well in the military. So hydroplate, here's a cross-section of what it was like prior to the flood. So you have this crust comprised mostly of granite, and there was some seas on top of that. The mountains were not as tall as before, and there was some subterranean water beneath that granite crust. Right below that is a basalt layer, and then right below that is the mantle. So when the flood started to happen, that crust started to crack. And it cracked along the mid-oceanic ridge. And so we have the water coming out from the subterranean water, and then because of the pressures of that crust on that water, it pushed all the water into the upper atmosphere, and then it was eroding that crust at that same time. As a result, that was the source of the sediments. So we can see that everyone pretty much agrees that the continents fit in some sort of jigsaw pattern with each other. But the difference here with the hydroplate theory is the North and South American plate simply moved west, and the Europe and African plate simply moved east. Whereas with the plate tectonics, there's more of a nonlinear direction of all the plates. So this is one of the differences between the hydroplate theory and the catastrophic plate tectonics. And this mid-oceanic ridge is all around the world. It is not just in the Atlantic, it's in all the major oceans. So as the crust split apart, that is when the ridges formed, that basalt layer underneath buckled, and then it came up. After 40 days, it stopped raining, but water was still coming out from the subterranean water until day 150, and it was still eroding that granite crust at the surface. So here, this is just another diagram showing that the continental rise, the continental shelf, and then the continental rise is where the plates used to connect before it cracked at the start of the flood. And here's another view of the continental shelves and continental rise. It's about 2 miles deep from the continent surface down to the bottom of the continental rise. If you have the entire planet and it was completely flat, the water would be at a depth of a little bit more than 1.5 miles. So prior to the flood, you can still have mountains. And as long as it's not too high, it can still be covered by water. But here we see that now, because of this crustal movement and the separation of the plates, you form these massive ocean basins, and that's where all the water went. So that would account for how the waters could flood everything prior to the flood, and where did all the water go during the flood. So towards the end, when all the water started coming up, there was very few water underneath that crust, and then so that crust hit that basalt layer underneath and started to slow down. Because of the frictional forces, it would form molten rock. And also during that point, because it was hitting that basalt layer and it was moving, it was slowing down and it was buckling and then forming all the mountain ranges. That is why we see a lot of the mountain ranges parallel to the ridges. This is a topographical map of the southeastern part of the United States. And it looks as if there was some sort of major erosion event, a single major erosion event, where all this water was receding from the continent into the oceans. And this is a map of the sediments off of the oceans, and then so you can see where the sediments came and eroded off the continents. We have a lot of submarine canyons off the coast. It looks exactly like canyons that you see on land. So how do you explain that? Well, with the global flood, that was also formed during the erosion. And Monterey Canyon is right off Monterey Bay. It is about the size of the Grand Canyon. So how would you explain that? We have submarine canyons all around the world. Here's some off of Washington coast. So off major coasts, we see submarine canyons. Now, as this water was on the surface of the earth and the mountains were forming, there was pockets where the mountains were trapping water. So it was almost like a bathtub being formed, and then there's water in it. But during some point, the water escaped from that, and then there was a failure in those basins. And so here is a topographical map of the western part of the United States. And I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but around here, there was almost like, it seems like one of these basins that trapped water, and then it escaped here. And let's take a look at that. So what they proposed was, this had trapped water, and they called it Grand Lake and Hopi Lake. And there was a breach near Marble Canyon, and that's where that red triangle is right there. And that is where the water broke through and eroded all that area in that lake, the Grand Lake and Hopi Lake, and then the water went down very rapidly, and to the southwest is the Grand Canyon. So this is how it explains the formation of these major erosion areas. We'll take pictures, some photos of that later. But it also explains how the canyons of the world formed. Through areas where there was massive water buildup, there was a breach, and then that rapid water formed these canyons. Here is a picture of a close-up of Marble Canyon. So Marble Canyon is right there in the middle, and you see the wall cliffs in the distance. Those wall cliffs are 12 miles across. So something catastrophic happened here to form this huge valley 12 miles across, and it looks like some sort of major water erosion event. And then at the very end stages, it formed this small, relatively small Marble Canyon. So at Grand Lake and Hopi Lake, you see this major erosion. And it looks as if layers got deposited, and then some major water event happened to erode all that out of there. It wasn't just a river that did this. It was as if this whole area was covered with water, and then like a bathtub, and then someone just pulled the plug. Same in Grand Lake, Hanksville, in Arizona. This area is massive. So how are you going to explain this with conventional geology? And then we're all familiar with the Grand Canyon. That rapid water that got released formed the Grand Canyon. Now, towards the late part of the stage is the recovery, and we're still in that period right now, in which the continents are settling down into the mantle. And at the same time, the sea levels are rising. So what that meant was, at the past, the continents were much higher and the sea level was much lower, and that caused land bridges all around the world. And so that would explain how animals and humans were able to go to the different continents, because there were land bridges that existed back then. So there's a lot of similarities between catastrophic plate tectonics and hydroplate. They both believe in a global flood. They both believe in crustal plate movement. The sedimentary strata was largely created by the global flood. Fossils formed, oil and coal formed, mountains formed, and massive erosion formed. The difference is really only in the plates themselves. So in catastrophic plate tectonics, it doesn't really explain the origin of the plates, because the plates already existed prior to the flood. With the hydroplate theory, the flood formed the plates. The plates did not exist independently prior to the flood. The origin of the sediments from the catastrophic plate tectonics is mostly from the ocean floor. Whereas with the hydroplate theory, the sediments was from that eroding crust that was coming out of the cracks. In the catastrophic plate tectonics, it is the mantle convection that is moving the plates. In hydroplate theory, it is that crust that is riding on the water and that weight pushing down on the water and then the water moving up. That is what's moving the plates. And for the life cycle of the plates, in the catastrophic plate tectonics, the plates are continuously being recycled. Whereas in the hydroplate theory, it is not being recycled. It just formed, moved, and then pretty much it is at its end phases right now. So to recap the first week and recap today, I talked about the biblical account of the flood. I talked about the conditions before the flood, conditions during the flood, and conditions after the flood. And I presented the 4 flood models, the simplistic flood model, which no creation scientist believes. There's the canopy theory, which was the first model that was proposed, largely been abandoned today by the creation scientists. And we have 2 major models presented, the catastrophic plate tectonics and the hydroplate theory. And we looked at this. The reason I bring this is because some people have the misconception that the water only rose up until day 40, whereas it only rained for 40 days, but the water kept rising until day 150. Also want to add that even though the creation scientists proposed catastrophic plate tectonics and the hydroplate theory, I believe portions of the canopy theory could still be valid, but it has to be combined with catastrophic plate tectonics or the hydroplate theory. Now, both of these have strengths and weaknesses, but over time, I believe these models will be replaced by even better models that can explain some of the weaknesses. So, in summary of last week and this week, last week I covered arguments why a global flood occurred, and I believe it is a very reasonable position to hold given the biblical, historical, and empirical evidence. And today we covered what likely happened during the Genesis flood, given the Bible and given scientific models. So I will open it up for questions for the next however time that we have left.
There you go, Mike. Thank you.
Oliver, several questions. One, did the opening up the great fountains of the deep create volcanoes? Number one. Number two, what's the explanation for the Ice Age? And are we global warming fixing the Ice Age now? And is this any explanation for why they find tropical grasses in the stomach of frozen mammoths in the Arctic?
Yeah.
So instantly frozen, instantly.
Yes, very good questions. So I intentionally did not cover the Ice Age because there's 2 views of the Ice Age. So in the catastrophic plate tectonics, they believe that the Ice Ages happened after all the flood. For probably, I'm not sure how long they say, maybe a couple of hundred years after that, because the atmosphere had changed. In the hydroplate theory, they believe that the Ice Age happened during the flood. So they have 2 different views about that. So I wanted to avoid talking about that since that's even more things. There's actually a lot of things I did not cover about both of these theories. It's just very high level. About the magma, that is also 2 different views. So with the hydroplate theory, what that proposes is all of that magma was formed during when the crust was hitting that basalt layer underneath, and it was those frictional forces was causing the formation of that molten rock. Whereas the catastrophic plate tectonics, they believe that that lava, molten rock, has always existed and continues to exist now. So there's 2 different views about where the lava came from.
The lack of human fossils. I'm curious about that.
Well, God said that he's going to wipe away all the humans, so he really did that. He wiped away all trace of humans. That's from a biblical answer. From a more looking at it from a more empirical evidence point of view, the flood was not a single event. It happened over a period of time. And as I showed you in Tim Clary's research of the megasequences, there was like at least 6 phases of the flood. So you have these sequences, and each sequence is sort of similar. And so what Tim Clary proposes is that it was 6 different stages of the flood. So the first stage of the flood flooded everything that was at the bottom of the ocean and things like that. So that's why we see primarily marine fossils. We don't see any mammals, any land animals, anything like that at the bottom, at the very bottom stages of the megasequences. As we start getting to the top, we start seeing more and more. So what that seems to imply was that the early stages of the flood only affected the marine life. And so as it got more and more higher, these land animals went to higher and higher terrain. And then we start to see land animals being flooded. And then at the very end, we start seeing the large animals. So we can probably include humans at the same time, that the humans were going more towards the higher and higher land areas, towards the late stages of the flood. At the very end stages of the flood, they just simply died in the water. So that's one reason. That's one possible explanation. There's other explanations as well, but I tend to lean towards that one.
Oliver, in your research with the naturalist or your reading of the scripture, why the difference in the speed of the crustal movements? I mean, is it related to the weight of the water? The question is, why did we have such a, crustal movements being moved at several feet a second versus now where we have it being moved a couple feet every year? Yeah.
So what John Baumgartner is proposing is that runaway subduction. And what he proposes is, think of like a pendulum, and normally the pendulum would like to be at the bottom. But suppose you put it at the very top, and then you let it go, the pendulum is going to swing down like this. So what he's proposing is, similarly, the crust was heavy at the very beginning. And then, because it was so heavy, and then the mantle rock was so light, it just moved down like this very quickly. Now, he does not really explain what triggered that, because it was at that state for a while before the flood actually started. And so one question is, well, what triggered that? Why didn't it happen earlier? And why did it happen during that flood? So that I couldn't figure out how to explain that. But it does explain what actually why does it cause it to be 1 billion times faster? So that is what they propose.
Thanks, Oliver. The structures or the huge structures out west I've seen in there puzzling me all through the years, and not to argue with the scientists, but my mind is kind of science-oriented too, and I just let it be. But I've mentioned this before, but to me, an asteroid with the mass and the speed would have caused everything that is all settled as an Earth forms. It would cause massive changes all the way through the Earth. And the closer you get to the center of the Earth, of course, it's a lot hotter. And it just seems that there's a lot more prevalence on the Earth shaking and moving and all the way through the world. It would be much more, to my understanding, than slow plate changing or.
Okay.
It's just amazing to get into this again.
Okay. Yeah. So probably you could put that on the Facebook group, and then we can look more into that. Doesn't really directly relate to this, but we can talk about that on the Facebook group.
Oliver, back here.
Okay.
We have a missionary we've supported for many years, and he's very knowledgeable about a lot of subjects. And one of the things that he suggested with the catastrophic plate movement, I can't remember, the cataclysmic, he said that, and this is my question, that the Earth also assumed the tilt at 23 degrees, which is very necessary at this point for the life of our planet. So that's my question. Could, during that time when the plates were shifting quickly, the Earth tilts, a lot of seasonal things occurred. And then also in one of the genealogies, and I used to know this, there is a list of the heads of families, and then at the end of that list, it says, and in that time the earth shifted. And I don't know if, I think it might have been Genesis, but I can go back and look for it. But do you know what I'm talking about? I hope.
I think Bob can answer that. So in both catastrophic plate tectonics and the hydroplate theory, actually they do both propose that the tilt of the Earth got affected, and even more than that. So, yeah, I didn't go into all that detail, but both of those actually do propose that. Maybe you're talking about Peleg.
His name was in that list.
Yeah.
I do remember that. And it may have had nothing to do with plate shifting.
Yeah. I think it was more like Peleg. The Earth was divided at that time. So some creation scientists also use that to argue plate tectonic movement, that Earth being divided. Or it also can talk about land bridges during that time. So there's different views on that as well.
Oliver, I've got a question. Carbon-14 is only good for about 50,000 years or so. But the question is, how do the Creation Research Institute folks respond to the radioisotope dating of the strata of rock where the fossils are found?
Yeah, that's very, very good question. And I think I mentioned last week that's going to require another talk. So for the old Earth proponents, radioactive dating is one of the major arguments, and it has to be seriously taken and seriously considered. The other problem is the distant objects in outer space. They're on the order of millions and billions of light years away. And so if you travel at the speed of light, which is the fastest thing in the universe, it would take you millions and billions of years for light traveling at the fastest speed to get there from here. Those are the top two arguments. And it'll take a while to address all of that. There are some proposals that young Earth creationists make for that, but they do not really explain it all. However, on the flip side, those who believe in the old Earth also have a lot of questions on radioactivity and light that they cannot explain either. So I see it more as problems on both sides. There's arguments on both sides. There's problems on both sides. And I think as Christians, we need to understand both of those. We need to understand all the arguments. And I've tried to be fair in all my talks here. I think we should understand all the arguments for an old earth and a young earth. So we shouldn't be just enamored with one view. We should at least understand it so that we can talk to people about why you believe the things that you do believe, and give biblical evidence and give empirical evidence as well, and historical evidence. So that's a roundabout answer to the question about radioactivity. But in terms of the sedimentary strata, you cannot date that using you cannot date that using uranium, strontium, argon, all those things, because those are good for other types of rock, igneous rock and metamorphic rock. So for the sedimentary rock, they have to use other types of dating for that. And normally they do not use radiometric dating for that. If you do use radiometric dating for it, a lot of it, as I pointed out before, points to something under 100,000 years old.
Oliver, you're at the university, and where do the secular scientists stand? Or would they listen to these arguments, or what is their worldview concerning this?
Okay, here's my opinion. If the Bible says it, they're not going to believe it. If the Bible doesn't say it, okay, then I can possibly believe it. So, how do they explain a lot of these formations of these features on Earth? Well, what they believe is Ice Age. Or they believe, especially like in Washington, in the scablands, you see massive erosion. And what do they propose? They propose ice dams, multiple ice dams. And so as long as it's not a flood, it's acceptable in science. So you can propose anything you want. You can propose the whole Earth was frozen, snowball Earth. You go look that up. They believe this. The whole Earth was frozen. So they can believe that the whole Earth was covered by ice. But if it's covered by water, no, we would reject that. So I just find it interesting that if it's in the Bible, they just won't accept it. But if it's even more crazy than what the Bible says, yes, it's possible that it happened. That's my opinion.
How would you lead this to the gospel? How would you share the gospel?
With the flood? It's because during the last days will be like the days of Noah. And we will be judged by God with fire, as the water was the judgment of humanity before. God hates sin. But at the same time, God is patient with us. He's not some mean father who says, okay, you sin, I'm going to give you 10 lashings right away. He gives us time to repent. It took a long time for Noah to build the ark. And it was a massive boat. And I'm sure everybody was talking about it. If you build a boat in your backyard that size, your neighbors are going to be talking about it. And they're going to ask, what in the world are you doing? And Noah said, God's going to judge this world. And I have plenty of space on this ark for you as well. And you can come on the ark with me. But nobody believed him. And the ark is a representation of Jesus. There was only one door into the ark. And you had to go through that door by faith because you've never seen a massive rain before. And you're going to trust that once you go into that door, you are going to be saved from destruction. Through Jesus, Jesus is the door. And Jesus is our only salvation. You're not going to be able to swim and survive this flood. You're not going to be able to escape God's judgment. And so the only way to escape God's judgment is through the only door, Jesus. But unfortunately, what we see is that a lot of people don't care. They don't care that there's going to be a judgment. And it's going to be just like the days of Noah. But God is patient with us. And God will share the gospel throughout the world. God will have preachers of righteousness, just like Noah, preach the gospel. And that's our responsibility. Our responsibility is not to cram people into the ark. Our responsibility is just to share the gospel and to share the message and just to be faithful with what God has called us to do. So in that way, I believe the ark, the flood, is very relevant to today because I believe we are near the end times as well. I hope
Oliver?
that answers that question.
I thank you for. I did not know last two theories, so it's kind of news to me. I have to look into it. But when it comes to flood, my favorite part is rainbow. Was rainbow optically possible before the flood, or it was possible only after the flood?
That is a very good question. And let me ask a sort of a different question. If you have different theories and different models, how do you know which one is correct? So I believe there's multiple ways to determine that, but one way is that model has to be consistent. It has to, you can't have all these, this is an exception, or we can add this exception, or we can add this ad hoc answer to it. It's got to be a consistent view. So I believe a global flood model is consistent because it says that it did not rain prior to the flood. A mist came out from the water to water everything. So the only way you can see a rainbow, up in the sky is if it rained. There has to be rain in the distance, the sun's behind you, and then the light rays is refracting into your eyes because of different wavelengths. It's going to have an effect of different colors. So I believe that's very consistent with the belief that God sent this rainbow after the flood. That's when the rain started. And so to me, that's another evidence that it was global in nature because it just makes that whole thing very consistent. If you believe in a local flood, you're going to have to explain that. How are you going to explain why did God send this sign, the sign that I will never flood again after the flood? Because if it rained prior to the flood, you're going to see rainbows as well. So I believe this global flood is a very consistent view.
The theory or point of is not the earth still cooling and, quote, shrinking? And that, I think this whole thing is still occurring in my mind in the fact we have stratigraphic traps, faults, so on, having been in the oil industry in the past.
Yes.
In West Houston, there's a fault.
Yes.
And all of that has developed since the flood. Is this an ongoing process?
It is an ongoing process. So as I mentioned earlier, in the last stage of the flood, we're still in it. The plates are actually still moving because of momentum. So they've actually used GPS measurements to measure the movement of these plates. And so, all of these earthquakes is just simply two plates rubbing against each other for feet, meters, and it's causing massive earthquakes and tsunamis just by plates just minimally moving next to each other. Now, imagine plates either moving 1 billion times faster or it is splitting and forming the oceanic ridges. Just how much greater is that compared to just plates just moving next to each other, forming the earthquakes that we see now? It is a massive difference. So you can see how how catastrophic the flood was compared to what's happening now.
Thank you, Oliver. Any other? One more? Yeah.